This year marks the 150th anniversary of the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln, the guardian of liberty, who labored tirelessly that this nation under God might have a new birth of freedom. Building a future of freedom requires love of the common good and cooperation in a spirit of subsidiarity and solidarity.
In a letter to the Marquis de Lafayette, May 10, 1786, George Washington says, "It is one of the evils of democratical governments, that the people, not always seeing and frequently misled, must often feel before they can act right, but then evils of this nature seldom fail to work their own cure." And he says, that every citizen would take pride in the name of an American, and act as if he felt the importance of the character, by considering, that we ourselves are now a distinct nation, the dignity of which will be absorbed, if not annihilated, if we enlist ourselves, farther than our obligations may require, under the banners of any other nation whatsoever.
Our one responsibility as members of Congress is to enable this country, by your legislative activity, to grow as a nation. You are the face of its people. They are representatives. You are called to defend and preserve the dignity of your fellow citizens in the tireless and demanding pursuit of the common good. For this is the chief aim of all politics.
It is natural that the words we hear reflect upon us according to our own interpretation, but what Francis means concerning the common good is polis, or common good under his city-state sovereignty according to his global political religious system by a subsidiarity of strong nations and states in fraternal solidarity, which would cause cooperation from other nations and states by subduing them under his system in solidarity as subsidiaries, but not necessarily fraternal.
A political society endures when it seeks as a vocation to satisfy common needs by stimulating the growth of all its members, especially those in situations of greater vulnerability or risk. Legislative activity is always based on the care of supported people. To this, you have been invited, called, and convicted by those who elect you.
In the encyclical Caritas in Veritate Chapter 6, Section 7, Paragraph 1, the papacy asks his followers to make the complex of institutions that give structure to the life of society, juridically, civilly, politically and culturally, a polis, or city, for the common good. And that any vocation and according to the degree of influence he wields, is to be considered in the polis, and contributes to the building of the universal city of God, which is the goal of the history of the human family. Accordingly, he says that in an increasingly globalized society, the common good and the effort to obtain it cannot fail to assume the dimensions of the whole human family, that is to say, the community of peoples and nations, in such a way as to shape the earthly city in unity and peace, rendering it to some degree an anticipation and a prefiguration of the undivided city of God. In other words, Benedict XVI is saying that the integral system of the Vatican is to integrate nations and states into his city-state system under not only the ecclesiastical authority, but also political authority of the vicariate of Jesus Christ, that is to say, under himself as the substitute of Jesus Christ in power and authority, who is the only begotten Son of God, and the fullness of the Godhead bodily, which is a worldwide integration movement. And he says of the apparent allure of integral human development, which is in part the spirituality of metaphysics and theology, or in other words, theology subject to metaphysics, that it gives understanding to the transcendent dignity of man, and is subject to the category of relations, which implies being one global family under the papacy. Biblically, it is revealed that the strategy of ancient Rome is to divide and subdue nations. The subversive nature of the papal political religious system of Rome is metaphysics. Specifically, the metaphysical system of potentiality, universal, and actuality. Potentiality is like the subject in grammar. An example is to say the Pope, but what about the Pope? Actuality is like the predicate, which answers the question, as, wants to subdue the world under his polis. This reveals the result, the Pope wants to subdue the world under his polis. But, how would he subdue the world under his city-state political religious system? He would subdue the world under his system by forces in a universal or sphere, which would cause the desired result by deliberate conditioning and cultivation of societies through the potentiality of the followers of the polis in a nation or state, meaning, they are subject to the forces of peoples according to their laws and spirituality in a universal sphere, which would bring about the actuality of a papal state. Yet, this nation is formed of a perpetual compact of states, according to the manifest destiny, which extends from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. And from the beginning, this nation of United States justifies its entitlement to exist by the laws of nature and of nature's God, according to the rectitude of intentions. Thereby, its man-made liberty is nearkin to inclusive nature itself, which all have in common, not spirituality or religious beliefs. Therefore, if any provide for and satisfy the needs of a neighbor in the spirit of Christian charity in performing duties in behalf of the public good in a respective nation or state because of religious conviction, it is a contribution to the general welfare, even globally. Also, it is a freedom for each diverse religious individual because of religious liberty. But, to subdue institutions of a nation or state under a foreign sovereign by intrigue, to pursue a worldwide integration into a city-state religious political system by using any respective system of government and its resources in a way that gives allegiance to that or any foreign system, it is subversion. What is subversion? Subversion is the undermining or detachment of the loyalties of significant political and social groups within the victimized state, and their transference, under ideal conditions, to the symbols and institutions of the aggressor. Subversion refers to an attempt to transform the established social order and its structures of power, authority, and hierarchy. Subversion is actions designed to undermine the military strength, economic strength, psychological strength, or political strength or morale of a governing authority. Subversion is a destructive, aggressive activity aimed to destroy the nation, or geographical area of your enemy, by demoralizing the cultural values and changing the population's perception of reality. The common good appears to originate from the 1563 Council of Trent, by which the Universal Church of Rome has ordained, and enjoins, that the sacred canons, and all the general councils, as also all other apostolic ordinances, published in favor of ecclesiastical persons, of the liberty of the Church, and against the violators thereof, all which it also renews by this present decree, be exactly observed by all men, and it admonishes the emperor, kings, republics, princes, and all, and each of whatsoever state and dignity they be, that, the more bountifully they are adorned with temporal goods, and with power over others, the more religiously should they respect whatsoever is of ecclesiastical right, as belonging especially to God, and as being under the cover of his protection. The 1983 Revised Canon Law of the Roman Catholic Church says, a person who has legislative power can also issue penal laws, within the limits of his competence by reason of territory or of persons. Moreover, he can by his own laws also strengthen with an appropriate penalty a divine law or an ecclesiastical law issued by a higher authority. Insofar as possible, diocesan bishops are to take care that if penal laws must be issued, they are uniform in the same city or region. Penalties are to be established only insofar as they are truly necessary to provide more suitably for ecclesiastical discipline. In other words, the canon laws from the universal sphere of the polis or Vatican City-State sovereignty of Roman Catholicism says to make laws that will condition a society under her ecclesiastical discipline. Also, the 1983 revised canon law of the Roman Catholic Church says in Canon 1369 and Canon 1373 that a person who in a public show or speech, in published writing, or in other uses of the instruments of social communication utters blasphemy, gravely injures good morals, expresses insults, or excites hatred or contempt against religion or the Church is to be punished with a just penalty. And, a person who publicly incites among subjects animosities or hatred against the apostolic see or an ordinary because of some act of power or ecclesiastical ministry or provokes subjects to disobey them is to be punished by an interdict or other just penalties. Therefore, according to this law of the polis, if any disagrees that the Pope is Vicar of Christ, that is, the substitute of Jesus Christ, who is the only begotten Son of God, in power and authority, it is blasphemy and punishable, or if someone speaks out against the act of an ordinary, that is, an inquisitioner, which causes his subjects to disobey them, it is punishable if the Pope obtains civil power through a nation's civil laws. This is the nature of his temporal sovereignty, which he would fully restore and expand in the New World. The Roman Catholic Church says, the present-day legislation against heresy has lost nothing of its ancient severity, but the penalties on heretics are now only of the spiritual order. All the punishments which require the intervention of the secular arm have fallen into abeyance, which means, it is suspended. In other words, punishments, whether by the loss of citizenship, confiscation of property, banishment, or even torture and death for violations against Roman Catholic canon laws and councils, are suspended until it has support through a nation's civil laws, or by spiritual means, or by those in power who uphold the subversive laws of the polis, which are not compatible with the fundamental nature of our liberty. Notably, heretics are Protestants or those who follow Protestant doctrine. As a statesman, James Madison has stated the following facts in his opposition to religious assessment: torrents of blood have been spilt in the Old World, by vain attempts of the secular arm to extinguish religious discord, by proscribing all difference in religious opinions. Another fact is that the policy is adverse to the diffusion of the light of Christianity, the light of revelation, which resulted in Protestants separating from the Universal Church of Rome, and forming independent religious sects based on the restitution of biblical truths. Near the start of the U.S. Civil War, unification of Italy threatened the temporal sovereignty of the papacy. Therefore, a desperate Pius IX wrote an encyclical about the injustice against his civil power and encouraged his subjects to uphold his temporal sovereignty in order to maintain his remaining patrimony in Italy. Accordingly, Pius IX says the following to the Universal Church of Rome. To the venerable brothers, the patriarchs, primates, archbishops, bishops, and other ordinaries keeping favor and communion with the apostolic see. Greetings and the apostolic blessing. You vehemently denounced the sacrilegious attacks made on the civil power of the Roman Church. And defending constantly this dominion, you proclaimed and taught that God gave the civil power to the Roman pontiff, so that he, never subject to any power, might exercise in full liberty and without any impediment the supreme task of the apostolic ministry divinely committed to him by Christ our Lord. Notwithstanding the unification of Italy and the effort to maintain the temporal sovereignty of the papacy, correspondence during the U.S. Civil War from Secretary of State, Mr. William H. Seward to Mr. Rufus King, U.S. Ambassador to Rome says on April 29, 1861. Rome is protected by the veneration of a large portion of mankind for His Holiness as the expounder of faith and the guardian of religion. He is a friend to peace, to good order, and to the cause of human nature, which is now, as it always has been, our cause. Let the government of Rome set this example and exercise its great influence in favor of a course of natural justice among nations. Notably, the U.S. ambassador was to assure the Vatican that, we will not violate the friendship already so happily existing by any intervention in the domestic affairs of the states of the Church, that it is the settled habit of this government to leave to all other countries the unquestioned regulation of their own internal concerns, being convinced that intrusion by a foreign nation anywhere tends only to embarrass rather than aid the best designs of the friends of freedom, religion and humanity, by impairing the unity of the state exclusively interested. In March of 1863, Judah P. Benjamin, the Secretary of State for the Confederate States of America, revealed the following to Jefferson Davis about the pursuit of Napoleon III, the Emperor of France. He conveyed, "His Imperial Majesty aims steadily at the restoration of Mexico as it was prior to the independence of Texas. In the event of his success an empire would be created whose crown would perhaps satisfy the ambition of Jerome Napoleon and remove that red Republican prince definitely out of the way of the Prince Imperial, to the joy of the Emperor and Empress." Accordingly, on April 14, 1864, Roman Catholic Emperor Ferdinand Maximilian was sent from Austria to Mexico to set an example of liberty in the West under Pius IX through the French government while the U.S. Constitution was vulnerable to civil war. But, on April 4, 1864, the United States House of Representatives had denied recognition to the Empire of Mexico, which overthrew the Mexican Republic. Under Pius IX, Emperor Maximilian was to end discrimination against Native Americans and promote equality. He provided for the general welfare in behalf of the poor with his own donation, and devoted time to personally listen to complaints, and decreed freedom of expressing opinions upon all official acts, but yet, Emperor Maximilian insisted upon maintaining entire freedom of conscience and worship, which is contrary to the temporal pursuits of the papacy. Therefore, in the tireless pursuit of his common good, the papacy wrote the emperor a letter dated October 18, 1864 that was received on March 18, 1865 in the U.S. State Department in Washington, D.C. by Secretary Ignacio Mariscal. Quotes extracted say, "Your Majesty is well aware that, in order effectually to repair the evils occasioned by the Revolution, and to bring back as soon as possible happy days for the Church, the Catholic religion must, above all things, continue to be the glory and the mainstay of the Mexican nation, to the exclusion of every other dissenting worship. No person may obtain the faculty of teaching and publishing false and subversive tenets. Instruction, whether public or private, should be directed and watched over by the ecclesiastical authority, that, in short, the chains may be broken which, up to the present time, have held down the Church in a state of dependence, and subject to the arbitrary rule of the civil government." The Confederate States were willing to aid France and Mexico against the United States for recognition of their own sovereignty contrary to the Monroe Doctrine of 1823, which says of European political systems, "We owe it, therefore, to candor and to the amicable relations existing between the United States and those powers, to declare that we should consider any attempt on their part to extend their system to any portion of this hemisphere as dangerous to our peace and safety and happiness. Also, we could not view any interposition for the purpose of oppressing them or controlling in any other manner their destiny, by any European power, in any other light than as the manifestation of an unfriendly disposition toward the United States." Accordingly, President Lincoln, who maintained separation of church and state, also guarded the southern border against an invasion during the Civil War, notably in order to take back Texas, which would have become a papal state. A successful invasion would have divided the nation into the United States of America, Confederate States of America, and Papal States of America, with the restoration of Texas and the former Mexican territory before the U.S.-Mexican War. After the loss of the nation, the country would have continued to be subject to metaphysical forces, that is to say, the operations of fraternal Roman Catholics. This would have resulted in conflicts of division in the various states in behalf of peace under the polis. But then, 1 year later, on the day that Emperor Maximilian came to set an example by a rival liberty in the West under Pius IX on April 14, 1864. On Good Friday, April 14, 1865, President Abraham Lincoln and Secretary of State William Henry Seward were assassinated by conspirators, who met in the boarding house of a devout Roman Catholic, named Mary Surratt. Secretary of State Seward survived his wounds, but President Lincoln died from his wound the following morning. John Wilkes Booth, the assassin of President Lincoln, was fatally wounded by a Union soldier. The rest of the conspirators, which includes Mary Surratt, were executed by hanging. Founding Father Alexander Hamilton has warned about the operations of nations in the collective bodies of society, apparently to cause a new social experience for democratic change, saying, "The causes of hostility among nations are innumerable. There are some which have a general and almost constant operation upon the collective bodies of society. Of this description are the love of power, or the desire of preeminence and dominion, the jealousy of power, or the desire of equality and safety. There are others which have a more circumscribed, though an equally operative influence, within their spheres, such are the rivalships and competitions of commerce between commercial nations. And there are others, not less numerous than either of the former, which take their origin entirely in private passions, in the attachments, enmities, interests, hopes, and fears, of leading individuals in the communities of which they are members. Men of this class, whether the favorites of a king or of a people, have in too many instances abused the confidence they possessed, and assuming the pretext of some public motive, have not scrupled to sacrifice the national tranquility to personal advantage, or personal gratification. In light of the subversive 2015 speech of Pope Francis on the assassination of President Lincoln in behalf of the polis, nevertheless, on January 27, 1837, Abraham Lincoln addressed the Young Men's Lyceum at Springfield on the perpetuation of our political institutions, saying, "We find ourselves under the government of a system of political institutions conducing more essentially to the ends of civil and religious liberty than any of which the history of former times tells us. We, when mounting the stage of existence, found ourselves the legal inheritors of these fundamental blessings. We toiled not in the acquisition or establishment of them, they are a legacy bequeathed us by a once hardy, brave, and patriotic, but now lamented and departed race of ancestors. Theirs was the task, and nobly they performed it, to possess themselves, and, through themselves, us, of this goodly land, and to uprear upon its hills and valleys a political edifice of liberty and equal rights. 'Tis ours only to transmit these, the former unprofaned by the foot of an invader, the latter undecayed by the lapse of time and untorn by usurpation, to the latest generation that fate shall permit the world to know. This task, gratitude to our fathers, justice to ourselves, duty to posterity, all imperatively require us faithfully to perform. At what point, then, is the approach of danger to be expected? I answer, if it ever reach us, it must spring up amongst ourselves. It cannot come from abroad. If destruction be our lot, we must ourselves be its author and finisher. As a nation of free men, we must live through all time, or die by suicide.